coming your way. Don't run. What do you think of our new wall of sound? Kansas, we're going to jail. For those of you who don't know, the police have come often, say we're too loud. This ain't gonna help. I'm thinking we're ready for the Oakland Coliseum. What do you think with this? Cool. Awesome. Well, hey, turn to Revelation chapter 13, and let's pray. Lord, your word declares that you know the end from the beginning. And Lord, you love us enough to tell us the truth about what lies on the future, so that our hearts need not be afraid. Lord, we also know that in the end, you do reign over evil, that your truth triumphs. And we're very grateful for that, and our hope is in that. And so, Lord, tonight as we focus on some of your scriptures, as we read your word, some very heavy yet controversial things, Lord, I pray that our minds would be quickened and our hearts would be warmed. In Jesus' name. Well, the buzzwords today you hear on the global scene are like New World Order or the world vision or village, the world village, globalism. Terms like these as humanity seeks to be united by celebrating diversity of culture, or united in economy, perhaps united in military, as we see coalitions often go to war now and not just nations. And someday soon, the world will be united in government as well. Revelation chapter 13 is a sneak preview of the government of the future. And it's not the far distant future, it's a very near future. A government with its figurehead, a world leader that is the best of what humanity has to offer. He rides in on a white horse. He brings peace. He solves problems. Ethnic divides are healed. He wins affection, and eventually he will win the worship of the world. This one is called Antichrist. Now, many people have a hard time believing in the Antichrist. It's like believing in Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny or something, you know. And perhaps that's because throughout history, so many people have been declared as the Antichrist. People like Nero or Napoleon or Hitler. In the 80s, I remember Ronald Reagan was the Antichrist, they said, because it was Ronald Wilson Reagan, and that's six initials in his letter each, 666. So he must be the Antichrist, they said. But then they said, no, that's not him, it's Gorbachev, because he has that thing on his head. And then I saw a bumper sticker a while back, said, a vote for Clinton is a vote for Satan. And then I saw one here in Berkeley that said a vote for Bush is a vote for Satan. And so, none of those guys are him, by the way. But he will come, Antichrist that is, and I believe the world is ripe for him to come. Well, let's read about him, Revelation chapter 13, verse 1. Then I, this is John, stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name. Now John the Revelator is standing on the seashore, and he sees a vision of a beast that is rising up out of the sea. Now this beast is Antichrist. Now, Antichrist, when I say that word, that conjures up all sorts of images and emotions in our mind. And actually, John is the only New Testament writer who uses the term Antichrist. And what the term means is simply in place of Christ or against Christ. Actually, John writes of Antichrist in 1 John 4. He says, every spirit that does not confess that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is not of God. And this is the spirit of Antichrist, which you have heard was coming and now is already in the world. You see, when it comes to the term Antichrist, it's important to understand there's actually a threefold understanding that goes along with it. First of all, according to this here in 1 John 4, there is the spirit of Antichrist. That is, it's a spirit of people who would teach false things about Jesus. If there's a false teaching or false understanding, John says that's the spirit of Antichrist. Now, in John's day, there was a lot of this already going on. There was a group of people called the Gnostics, and they would say, well, Jesus wasn't real, it was a Christ consciousness. And John would go, well, I actually knew him personally, so you're wrong, And he called, you're an Antichrist, is what he would say to them. They would say Jesus wasn't a man, simply spirit. They actually even taught that Jesus, these Gnostic writers, taught that Jesus didn't even leave footprints in the sand when he walked, which messes the poem up, I'm walking, there's one footprint in the sand, and in those tough times in my life, there were no footprints in the sand. What's up? It totally ruins that. They said he was the phantom Messiah floating around, right? But others taught at that time that he was just a man, but he was like a superhero Jesus, but he wasn't God. And so John said, well, you're Antichrist as well. So he calls these guys teaching this stuff Antichrist, which, actually what's cool in the original language, he uses the tense where it'd be junior Antichrist or Antichrist Junior, which is kind of funny. Because their teaching was diminishing the reality of who Jesus was. They were reducing his character. They weren't claiming or believing or teaching the things that Jesus said about himself. Things like, when you have seen me, you have seen the Father. Stuff like that. So this would apply to all those who reduce who Jesus is. And so be it a Bible teacher or a cult leader or a school professor, anyone who would diminish Christ. Let's say you're sitting in class, those of you who are in college, and your professor starts going on one of their little anti-Christian tirades, and Jesus this, that, whatever. Just so, hey, you're a junior Antichrist. It'll be good for your grade. Try it out. It's biblical. You win big points. Anyway, John says more about him. 1 John 2:18, he says, little children, it is the last hour, and as you have heard that the Antichrist is coming, even now many Antichrists have come. So there's a spirit of Antichrist, that is those who teach falsely about Jesus. But then John also says there's a spirit of Antichrist that is running around in the world. This is like an attitude of Antichrist, an attitude. Now, when I think about this attitude of Antichrist or the spirit of Antichrist, of course I think about Nero in John's day. Nero, who desired to be worshipped as God, and if you didn't worship him as God, then he'd kill you. He'd feed you to the lions. And he took the Christians and he did that. He impaled them on the post. He lit them on fire in his gardens. Or I think of Stalin. Watched a documentary on him last night. 40 million people killed under his leadership. 40 million people, of his own people. He killed his generals. He killed his friends. He killed his enemies. He had a quota for how many people he wanted to kill. He killed the gypsies. Many of us who went to Russia, we went to the region of Kalmykia, and as you know, the Kalmyks were sent up by Stalin to Siberia to die off in the collective farms up there. This guy was horrible, yet while he was committing these atrocities back in Moscow, the crowds would cheer Stalin. They didn't know what he was doing, and they would call him Father, and they would worship him literally as their God. They would cry out, he is the Christ, and they erect big statues, and they have blimps with Stalin's face on it. They even had like this big giant, these searchlights. Like, how you have the bat signal and it shows the bat light thing up there? Well, they had a Stalin face that they would show in the clouds, and people would just get so excited about Father Stalin. They called him Christ, the new socialist man. And people were mesmerized by him, as they were Adolf Hitler, killing off 6 million Jews. Think about Hitler, man. The guy was a loser. And somehow he comes to rule Germany. How did that happen? Well, as you study world history, you see this scenario repeated over and over and over again. And there's no other explanation other than there's a spirit of Antichrist in the world. How else can you explain the tragedies and the atrocities and the bizarrities? So, you have those who diminish who Christ is, and then you have those who take the place of Christ in the hearts of the people. This is the spirit of Antichrist. But then there's also the literal Antichrist, Mr. Antichrist, the true Antichrist. He's a literal person, and we're reading about him here in Revelation chapter 13. He's a coming world ruler. He's a dictator, and he'll be known as Antichrist. And by the way, that's not his name. He's not going to have a name tag. Hi, I'm Mr. Antichrist. Glad to know you. That's his description of who he is. There's other names given to him in Scripture, like the son of perdition, or the little horn, Daniel calls him, with the big mouth, big little horn, I like to call him. He's the prince of the people to come. He's the vile shepherd, he's also called. And Jesus also warned us of him. So this Antichrist guy, well, he will be a very cunning, clever, smooth-talking guy, taking the place of Christ in the hearts of many people, diminishing the reality of who Jesus really is. He is totally opposed to the things of God. As a matter of fact, he is going to be the devil in the flesh, as we will see tonight. But he's not going to appear that way. He doesn't show up walking down the street, got, 7 heads and, 666 tattooed on him, and if you saw that guy walking on Telegraph, you go, that's the Antichrist, But he's not going to look that way. No, he's going to be a very charismatic character who will take the political world by storm. Antichrist, the beast who rises up, he's the second person of the terrible Trinity, the diabolical trio. You see, one thing about Satan is he copies everything the Lord does. And so the Lord, he's a Trinity. So Satan's got to have one too. And so we read of the beast last week, Satan, chapter 12. Tonight we're going to be introduced to Antichrist, right, who is like Jesus, trying to be Jesus. And then next week we're going to meet the false prophet, who's kind of like the Holy Spirit in this version. And the way it works, just as the Holy Spirit leads you to Jesus, who points you to God, while in the little devilish Trinity you have the false prophet who points you to Antichrist, who points you to the beast. It's a counterfeit. Well, here he is in chapter 13, pictured as this beast rising up, coming from the sea. Now, to understand this Bible terminology here, understand again that Revelation, most of the passages in Revelation are coming out of the Old Testament. And the terms have already been identified in the Old Testament. For example, when it speaks of the Mediterranean Sea here, the sea, well, that's what it is, it's the Mediterranean Sea. When the Bible speaks of the sea, it means one of two things. One, it's the actual Mediterranean. The other is, it means the Gentiles. The Gentiles is also called the sea. Israel's called the land in Bible typology. And so you have the sea of, because that the world's divided up as far as the Bible's concerned. You have Jews, you have Gentiles, which is anybody who's not a Jew, and then you have the church, which is ex-Jews and ex-Gentiles, right? And that's the way God sees things. Well, here, in chapter 13, Antichrist is rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his horns 10 crowns, and on his head a blasphemous name. Again, descriptive language. And what I want to do is I want you to keep your finger here, and I want you to turn back to Daniel chapter 7, where we're going to see that what we're reading about here has already been prophesied about and already identified. And as you're turning there to Daniel 7, I want you to think back and remember to last week how we discussed an image from Daniel chapter 2. You might remember how Nebuchadnezzar had that dream and he foresaw the coming empires of the world. And he saw the head of gold, which represented the Babylonian Empire. And after them would come the arms of silver, the Medes and the Persians. But after them came that waist of bronze, which represented the Greeks. And then after that came those long legs of Rome, the iron legs that represented Rome. And then there was this at the end, some coalition, this broken, these feet, 10 toes but broken. They were together but separate. And that, as we discovered last week, speaks of the European Union. And we'll see that again tonight. Now, Daniel chapter 7 that you just turned to is the same truth of that statue, but it's from a different point of view. For example, I was thinking of this, and have you ever been to Disneyland? Anybody been to Disneyland? Have you ever gone to the haunted house? Of course not. Christian, don't go in that place. No, of course. Haunted house rocks, by the way. And so you walk into the first room, right? And you hear that voice that comes over the loudspeaker and it says, "Welcome. We've been waiting for you," and you get all creeped out and stuff. And so you sit there and you're walking through this hallway, and you remember there's all those paintings that are painted of the people who once lived in this old Victorian mansion, and you look at those paintings and they're like very beautiful people, very elegant, right? They're just impressive. And you look at these things, but all of a sudden the light changes, and it's black light. And then all of a sudden you look at those paintings again, and they got like warts on their nose and snakes coming out of their hair, and it's just really gross and stuff like that. Well, that's what Daniel 7 is, really. It's kind of like that haunted mansion deal. You see, different light is thrown on something we have already seen in Nebuchadnezzar's vision in Daniel chapter 2 last week. You see, Nebuchadnezzar's vision represented man's point of view of the governments of this world, whereas Daniel chapter 7 represents God's point of view of the governments of this world. It's the same picture, it's just different light. And so Nebi's dream, you had this beautiful metallic statue represented the splendor of the coming kingdoms. And it was something that was elegant and valuable, strong and impressive. But then here in God's view, he sees things in a different light. And he doesn't see things as beautiful and impressive when it comes to the governments of this world. He sees them for what they are, ferocious beasts that devour one another. And so Daniel writes of this in verse 2 of Daniel chapter 7. He says, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. And four great beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other. Now again, just like in Revelation, you have the great sea, the Mediterranean, right? And four nations rising out. And so you can call these guys Club Med. That's the idea. Club Med, a beastly place. But the first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. This is Babylon. Why is it Babylon? Because archaeologists have discovered through their digs that this national symbol for Babylon is the lion with the eagle's wings. However, he continues, I watched till its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and a man's heart was given to it. And this is a reference to Nebuchadnezzar himself. There's a whole story about this, Daniel chapter 4. We don't have time for that tonight. But it's a story of how Nebuchadnezzar raised himself up in pride, and God humbled him by making him act like a beast and all that. That's what it's referring to. Verse 5, suddenly another beast, a second like a bear. It was raised up on one side and had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And they said thus to it, arise, devour much flesh. Well, the second beast is Medo-Persia. Medo-Persia. Now, in the ancient mind, the bear represents strength, but strength that is not swift. And Medo-Persian army was a very powerful army, but they didn't move very fast because there was 2.5 million of them. But they were strong like a bear, and it's raised up on one side. Well, why is that? Well, Medo-Persia, it's 2 different countries, Media and Persia. The Medes were stronger than the Persians, so the bear's raised up on one side. Has 3 ribs in his mouth. Why is that? Well, because historically, Medo-Persia devoured 3 kingdoms to get its power, Babylon, Egypt, and Lydia. Keep in mind, this is all prophecy for Daniel. This is years, centuries before this happened is when he wrote this. And then verse 6, after this I looked, and there was another like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird, and the beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. This third beast is a leopard, and in Daniel's day and age, this speaks of great swiftness. And because it has 4 wings, it means really fast. That's what it's a picture of, super fast, fast beyond its natural ability. And this was fulfilled historically by Greece under Alexander the Great, who conquered the Medo-Persian Empire in 4 years. It was swift beyond his capability, right? He just had this little army, and he was all guerrilla style, and he just took the big bad bear down, and it was nothing, for him to do that. Well, as you students of history know, at the age of 33 in Babylon, Alexander the Great was laying on his deathbed, weeping, crying, because there are no more worlds to conquer. And so he went out and he got drunk that night, he caught pneumonia, and he died. But as he was laying there on the deathbed, they asked him, well, who does the kingdom go to? Because he didn't have an heir. And he said, give it to the strong. And so therefore his kingdom was divided in 4 and given to his 4 generals, Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy. And he divided the empire as prophesied by Daniel. And then verse 7, I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong, and it had huge iron teeth, and it was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling with residue with its feet. And it was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. Now this beast was so ugly, Daniel couldn't compare it to anything living. I wonder if you ever saw a French poodle, because that's ugly. He might have described it as that. Now this verse deals, he didn't see a poodle, a final empire, we know from history. We're talking of the iron rule of Rome. Rome, who ate up nation after nation. But Rome differs because it was never conquered by anybody. It just fragmented and mutated into the world we have today. And according to this prophecy and others, it mutates back. and it comes back and it rears its ugly head again in the last days. Now, Rome has ruled for 1,000 years. Most scholars say about 1,000 years, but it never had this 10 ruler at one time thing happening, right? Now, again, as we talked about last week, people tried to reassemble the Roman Empire through the ages. Napoleon tried, Charlemagne tried, Kaiser Wilhelm tried, Hitler tried. They all tried and they all failed, all right? And so many believe that this coalition points to something that happens in the future. Now, again, I said this last week, but it bears repeating, and it's important that we understand this. You see, in 1948, a miracle happened, and that was that Israel became a nation again after being dead for 2,000 years. They're a nation again, fulfilling huge Bible prophecy. As a matter of fact, Jesus says of this particular prophecy that the generation that witnesses that event will not pass away till all things are fulfilled. Now, please understand what that means. It means when Israel becomes a country again, and some scholars say it's when it became a nation. Some scholars say when they took the city of Jerusalem. And there's a little debate on that, but all the same, it says the people who see that, well, they're not all going to die off until everything is fulfilled. Now, the people who saw that are getting pretty old right about now. So think about that. Something to ponder, right? Well, in 1950, going on with the same time, 2 years after that event, a political organization formed called the Club of Rome. The Club of Rome, 6 European countries who wanted to unite Rome again. They wanted 10 countries. They called themselves the Big Ten, even though they were 6. They were, ambitious, I guess. And they were ridiculed, right? People were like, you can't do it. You just had 2 world wars. Europeans do not get along, okay? It's not going to happen. But it happened, 1992. They signed a treaty, they dropped the borders, they united the currency, they elected leadership, they combined the military, and now they operate as a single unit. Oh, they're very different from each other, like the 10 toes, they're separated, but they are united. And you go, there's more than 10 countries now, and I left you hanging on that last week. Well, the ancient Jewish rabbi Haggai, he read this, and he believes that Rome would reunite, and there would be 10 nations, but then the 10 nations would grow, and they would continue to grow and continue to devour, continue to grow. That's also the view of Irenaeus in 140 AD, believe that as well. 10 nations that don't mix, 10 nations that continue to grow on and get a hold of more folks. And so many people believe that, like in Daniel chapter 7, verse 24, it speaks of they become 10, but then devour more. And so, for example, in 1991, Greece joined. In 1991, they have 10 nations. But then in 1995, Austria came in. So that would be 13 nations according to Daniel chapter 7, 24. And then in 23, it pictures them continue to march, continue to devour. And the idea in the language is it isn't just land, it's everything. They want control of everything. And so with the European Union, as you know, if you follow the story over there, countries come in, countries leave. Some want to have an empire, some just want to have the economy, and they're shifting and they're reorganizing, and they're always kind of doing this thing. By the way, they also divided the world into 10 trade regions for the sake of international law, but hey, Here's some other things about Europe. Check this out. Look at Europe. Look at its logos, its currencies. The woman who rides the beast. Does that sound familiar? Because we're going to read about that in a couple of weeks. That's a symbol to look for. The woman who rides the beast. Or what about the Tower of Babel? Speaking of, the story of the Tower of Babel, how God had scattered people because they were trying to build something against him. And so he confused their languages. Now they're saying, no, we have all our languages, but we have one voice, and we're rebuilding what God has scattered. Pridefully he's making that statement. And then they have all these different symbols, the 12 stars that we talked about. Again, the woman riding the beast, and on and on and on and on. It's here, folks. Years ago, we would teach, this is maybe going to happen someday. This is a possibility. It's a probability. Now we say it's history. It happened, and it happened in our generation. And it's going to continue to emerge. Stay tuned, you'll see what's going to happen. But it is definitely rising out of the sea. It is seeking to devour, as if you don't know this right now, the EU is trying to get absolute control of the internet, absolute control of NATO, and other things as well. And the currency, a world market that we're going to talk about next week. And we're talking about digital chips and stuff. It's going to be really fun. But anyway, back in Daniel 7, verse 8, he continues, speaking of this, I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one, coming up among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots. And there in this horn were the eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words. And we got the creepy picture up there to see that. It's scary, I know. You get nightmares. Don't stare at it. Verse 15. Skip down to verse 15. I, Daniel, I was grieved in my spirit within my body, and the visions of my head troubled me, no doubt. And I came near to one who stood by me, and I asked him the truth of all of this, and he told me and made known to me the interpretation of these things. He says, those great beasts, which are 4 kings which will arise out of the earth. But the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, even forever and ever. And then I wished to know the truth about the 4th beast, which was different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron and its nails of bronze, which devoured, broke in pieces, and trampled the residue with its feet. And the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn that came up, before which 3 fell, namely that horn which had eyes and a mouth, and spoke pompous words, whose appearance was greater than his fellows. And I was watching, and the same horn was making war against the saints and prevailing against them, until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was made in favor of the saints of the Most High. And a time came for the saints to possess the kingdom. Thus he said, the 4th beast shall be a 4th kingdom on the earth, which shall be different from all other kingdoms, and it shall devour the whole earth, trample it, break it in pieces. And the 10 horns are 10 kings who shall arise from this kingdom, and another shall rise after them. And he shall be different from the first ones, and he will subdue 3 kings. And he shall speak pompous words against the Most High, and he shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and he shall intend to change times and law. And the saints shall be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. That number again, 3.5 years is what that means. So let's stop a moment. Let's talk about leaders. We're always looking for good leaders. We love leaders who have ingenious solutions to our tough problems. We love leaders who can motivate us, leaders who can stir our hearts to endure hardships and achieve great things. We love leaders who give us a sense of purpose, give us a sense of pride. For example, Gandhi. That guy was a great leader. What he did for India is incredible. Or Winston Churchill, World War II. Amazing. Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War. These men were great leaders, and we're always looking for another. Well, here, listen to this quote. It says, for the first time, our civilized nation now has full gun registration. Our streets will now be safer. Our police will be more effective, and the world will follow our lead. That sounds pretty cool. Spoken in 1936 by Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler came on the scene. He restored Germany's pride. He solved the economic problems. People thought this guy is a great man of peace. People loved him. The churches loved him. Why? Because he restored a sense of morality to the country. The world politicians loved him. They said, that Hitler, that is a man of peace. We wish we had a guy like him at our helm, is what the Prime Minister Lloyd George of England said. Everyone was taken with Hitler. And Hitler took control of Germany. He fulfilled what everyone thought a leader should be. Now, I point that out to you to mention the fact that when a tyrant comes, he doesn't show up wearing a black cape and say, I'm your neighborhood deadly dictator, vote me in, it'll be fun. No, he's a little more subtle. He's a little more cunning than that. And so speaking of tyrants, in this vision among the 10 horns, we see something strange. It's a little horn that arises from this coalition, having these eyes and this mouth, right? And this, of course, is Antichrist. And he will come and he will lead the European Union. It's going to happen. Actually, check out this quote. It's Dr. Henry Speck. He's one of the organizational leaders of the European Union. And he says, we do not want another committee. We've had too many committees. What we want is a man of sufficient stature to hold together the allegiance of the people and lift us up out of this economic morass into which we are sinking. Send us a man, and if he be a god or a devil, we will receive him. Revelation 6, John wrote about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. The first one was the white horse, the one masquerading as the Prince of Peace. Oh, he brought other horses with him, war, death, famine. But first he brings peace. And people call this guy Messiah, and they follow him. And Jesus talked about him. He says, I have come in my Father's name, and you did not receive me. Another will come in his own name. Him you will receive. Even in Israel, this is Lubitzer Lobe Slaus, a big rabbi over there in Israel, told the Wall Street Journal this recently. What's going on now is like labor pains. It looks pretty messy, but what will come out is a new and living light. Messiah may be just an eye blink away. Not just in Europe, but in Israel, they are looking for Messiah. The world is looking for a leader, looking for someone to bring peace, looking for someone to solve problems, looking for the one to come in on the white horse. And he's going to come, and he's going to open his mouth, he's going to speak great things and pompous words, inspiring ideals. And the world's going to listen to him. And so with that as your backdrop, back to chapter 13 of Revelation. John says, Then I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his horns 10 crowns, and on his head a blasphemous name. Now the beast which I saw was like a leopard, and his feet were like the feet of a bear, and his mouth was like the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him power, his throne, and great authority. It's the same vision Daniel saw, only a little different. Daniel saw the beast rising out of the sea. But notice this, John sees it in reverse order. Well, why is that? Well, simple. For Daniel, it was future. Daniel saw that in 586 BC, and he looked forward to the future. John's sitting at the end of time, and he's looking back, and so he sees it backwards. But also, it's an empire coming out. It has the same elements of the other empires before it. It's a unity and diversity type of thing is what's being stated here. Now, this empire is led by the beast. And so John's going to go on and tell us what happens, a little more of the story about this leader. He says, I saw on one of his heads as if it had been mortally wounded, and his deadly wound was healed. And all of the world marveled and followed after the beast. So they worshiped the dragon who gave authority to the beast. And they worshiped the beast, saying, Who is like the beast? Who is able to make war with him? By the way, those last 2 phrases, who is like the beast, who is able to make war with him, that's a play on words from the Psalms. It's a mockery. The Psalms would say, who is like God, who can make war with him? But now in the end times, they're making a mockery of the things of God. Don't even have to wait till this happens. It's already happening now. Well, this indicates the scriptures, by the way, verse 3 there, mortally wounded. The idea here is what it sounds like. It's an assassination attempt made to the beast. There's probably some guy living in Montana, read this and goes, oh, that's the beast, I'm going to get him, Who knows? Something happens. But it's not just prophesied here, by the way, in Revelation. It's also in Zechariah chapter 11, where it says, Woe to the worthless shepherd. Again, that's a term for Antichrist. Who leaves the flock. A sword shall be against his arm. Against his right eye, his arm shall completely wither, and his right eye shall be totally blinded. So when he gets assassinated, it's something with his eye, something with his arm. But the deal is, Antichrist comes to power, a great man of peace. And as we have learned, he solved the economic issues. He healed the situation in the Middle East, right? And then when he has taken control and he has secured his position, then he's done in. He's taken out. But then he revives. He resurrects. Now, some scholars will debate to say, well, maybe he didn't really die. He's mostly dead, is what some scholars say. Maybe that's true. So he either revives or he resurrects. We don't know which for sure. But what we do know is that the dragon of chapter 12, who at this time in our stories was booted out of heaven, Revelation 17 says this that well. It says that when this happens, he goes to perdition. That is that the beast himself indwells Antichrist, and he becomes the devil in the flesh, and he arises, and then he goes into the temple, declares himself as God to be worshipped. And so Antichrist, the one who will be in the place of Christ in the minds of so many people, he rises to power. He's taken out, and he resurrects again. Now think about that. What would it be like, let's say, if John Lennon rose from the dead? Imagine. Or what if John F. Kennedy came back to life? What would the nation do? Princess Diana, if she came back, what would happen? Oh, the world would wonder, but then the world would worship. Well, Antichrist comes back, and he's on a roll, book deals, TV shows, Letterman. Seriously, check out the next verse. He was given a mouth, speaking great things and blasphemies. I mean, he's on Larry King. He's on Oprah. He's talking, man. Everybody's talking. Inspiring ideals, speaking blasphemies. That means, like the Caesars did of old, he is saying, I'm deity. I'm God in the flesh. Speaking great things. And it reminds me of those old, you ever see those old newsreels of Hitler talking, and you just watch that guy, and it's mesmerizing. You're just like, wow, there's something about that, you know? And that's kind of the idea here. And so he was given authority to continue for 42 months. That's 3.5 years, times time and half a time, 1,260 days, all the same number in prophetic literature. And then he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name, his tabernacle, and those who dwell in heaven. And it was granted to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. And authority was given him to overcome every tribe, tongue, and nation. And all who dwell on the earth will worship him, whose names have not been written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. The world will worship the beast. They will worship. Interesting, what did Lucifer want more than anything else? He wanted worship. As a matter of fact, he wanted worship so bad it led him to his own fall and destruction, as he was the anointed cherub that covers. He was the worship leader of heaven, but he wanted to be worshiped, so he fell. But then again, when he tempted Jesus, offering him the kingdoms of this world, what did he say? If you worship me, I will give you the kingdoms of the world. It's worship. Worship is what he's always desired. And now worship is what he receives as he indwells Antichrist. He gets it. He gets the worship. Now, verse 7 tells us something interesting. It was granted to him to make war with the saints and overcome them. So when Antichrist comes, he rises up, he's taken out, rises back again. Interesting, though, there's Antichrist's death is to deceive the world. Jesus' death was to save the world. Antichrist's resurrection, a fake one. Jesus' resurrection was the real one. It's a counterfeit again, as he counterfeits everything. But here when he resurrects, he makes war with the saints and overcomes them. Now many read this verse and they go, see, the church, they didn't get raptured. There they are in the middle of the tribulation getting wasted by Antichrist. They didn't get raptured. It's the saints. He's overcoming them, you see. Don't you understand? There's no rapture. Well, that's not a really good argument, because what does the definition of the biblical word saint? Well, the word saint simply means a called out one or a separated one. And there are 3 groups of people called saints. In the Old Testament, the Jews are called the saints. In the New Testament, the church is called the saints. And the other group lives in New Orleans. There's a football team called the Saints. No, actually, here, it's tribulation believers. They're all saints. So just because it says saint there doesn't mean it's the church. It could mean he's persecuted the remnant of the Jews, which we've already discovered in our studies he will. And he's also persecuting the tribulation believers, as we've studied in past studies that he will. So don't get hung up on the silly stuff. Well, anyway, he overcomes them. And what did Jesus say, by the way? Matthew 16:18. He says, I will build my church and the gates of hell will not overcome it. So again, it's not the church. Well, back in our story, verse 8, all who dwell on the earth will worship him, whose names have not been written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. Well, this is the real issue right here, isn't it? Is your name written in the Lamb's book of life? Because if your name is written there, you have eternal salvation. If your name is not written there, then you have eternal damnation. So an important question is, how do I opt into that list? How do I get in that list? How am I written in that book? Well, it's actually very simple. You simply believe. You believe in who Jesus is, the Son of God, who died on a cross for you, took judgment upon him, your judgment due you, and he died and he was buried and he rose again from the dead. and he ascended into heaven. He's coming back. And if you believe that, and as you trust in that, open a relationship with him, guess what? Your name gets opted into the Lamb's book of life. That's what salvation is. You will be found in this precious little book. And if not, well, then you're going to be hanging out with Antichrist. So, John says, verse 9, if anyone has an ear, let him hear. So check both sides of your head real quick. No, what's happening here now is Pastor John is going to speak very directly to you and me. What he's saying here is listen up, tune into what I am saying. And he says in verse 10, he who leads into captivity shall go into captivity. He who kills with the sword must be killed with the sword. And here is the patience and the faith of the saints. Well, what's he talking about? Well, you see, John is an apostle. He's the Apostle John, a disciple, a friend of Jesus. We know that. And we know that John is a theologian, writing for his scripture, writing for his doctrine. And we also know John is a prophet, as he prophesies of the last days in this book of Revelation. But first and foremost, I believe John is a pastor. He's a pastor who cares about his people. He cares deeply. And as you remember, he was overseeing 7 churches. And that's who he wrote this letter to. 7 churches he was overseeing in the area of Turkey. People who he knew personally. People he loved passionately. He cared for immensely. Churches that at this time, historically, when he wrote this letter, were going through incredible persecution by the Roman government. You see, it started actually in 29 BC. They had this idea, this is 100 years or so before this book was written. Over in the city of Pergamos, one of the cities which John was the bishop of, well, over there they initiated Caesar worship, where they wanted to unite the government. So the way you unite the government is you have a single religion. And so they would have you worship Caesar. And as you worship him, you could worship any other god you want. I mean, they didn't really care about that. But you had to worship him because that would unite the people and unite this huge empire. Well, it wasn't taken all that seriously. Well, not until Nero took the throne just a few years before this book was written. Now, Nero believed his own press clippings. Nero believed he was a god, and so he wanted to be worshipped as a god. And so he demanded this, and he says, you know what, you need to worship me as God, and if you do, I'm going to give you a document called a libellus that makes you legal with the state. And you got to carry that around for a year, and then every year you got to renew that thing by coming to a statue of me, throwing incense in a fire, and telling me, my bust, my statue, that I am God. Now the Christians refused to utter the words, Caesar is Lord, because they were going to worship only one God, Jesus, for only Jesus is Lord. And so therefore our brothers and our sisters who lived at that time were mercilessly persecuted. They were killed. They were filleted alive by the tens of thousands. They were marched before the crowds into the amphitheaters, into the colosseums. They were wrapped in animal skins and fed to the lions and to the wild beasts. They were lighted on fire in the gardens. They were dragged behind chariots. They would even do this one thing where they would get a husband and a wife. They would tie the wife to a pole, dump blood all over her, and they'd give the husband a stick, and they would let go all these wild animals and lions, and he had to defend her. And of course, she would get eaten before his eyes, and he would get eaten, and this just merciless stuff. They would take trees, like fledgling trees that you can still bend them. They would bend them down. They would tie a person to them, cut the ropes so that the trees would fly up and rip the person in half. They would do things like that. They would put you in scalding oil, boiling oil, to try to deep fry you to death. All this horrible stuff they did, and they did it for entertainment. Give the people some bread, let them see some violence, persecute some Christians. It'll be great. That's what they did back then. Actually, I read an article in the LA Times not too recently where a proprietor got himself in trouble down in LA with some animal rights activist. You see, on Sunday brunch, he was serving lion. And when they asked him in the LA Times about this, why are you serving lion? He goes, well, it's payback time. Now Christians eat lion on Sunday. It's pretty funny. And so John is writing, yes, he's writing much of prophecy, but keep in mind his immediate priority is to pastor his own people who are being persecuted, those being beaten, those being wiped out because they would not give in to the world system. And so what John is saying, and I can hear it in his heart, he's saying to those in that day, as I also believe the Holy Spirit wants to say to us in our day, we in this room who go through our own tribulations, our own trials. See, look, the one who is putting you in the prison. Look, the one who is unsheathing his sword against you, marching you into the Colosseum. The one who is coming against you, that one is going to go down. That's what he means by this verse here. He says, if you have ears to hear, listen. They're going down. He who leads into captivity shall go into captivity. He who kills with the sword must be killed with the sword. The beast coming out of the sea, the forces that seem so against us, they're going to backfire. It's going to collapse on them. They're going down. That seeks to enslave you, those things will be enslaved eternally. Those who come with the sword against you, they themselves will experience pain eternally. What he's saying is simply this, that you and I, we who read this book and understand the message of the book of Revelation, well, we are blessed. We are blessed because we know the end of the story. It's God who triumphs in the end, not evil. It's his truth that triumphs. The meek shall inherit the earth, not the beast. It's those saints of God who live for God. Return. And the earth is set up a kingdom of rightness and peace, not a kingdom of humanism and anti-God and changing times and law. That is reversing the natural order of things is what that means, as the world is trying to do now. Those who persecute God's people, they're going to be gone. And John's people needed to hear this message. They needed to understand because of what they were going through. And so tonight, you might find yourself here. Perhaps you're in a difficult marriage. Perhaps you're persecuted by your boss on the job. Perhaps the college professor is very unmerciful to you and your beliefs. Perhaps it's a financial pressure that is crushing down upon you. Perhaps it's a disease in your body eating away at you. Maybe it's your sinful flesh rising up against you, fighting with you, having you fall when you just want to do the things that are right. Well, he who has an ear, Pastor John says, listen to this because it's all going to be solved. The beastly things that arise in our lives, they're going down. Life is short. And it's not going to be like this forever. And so there's a blessing in this book for you and me to remind us that when terrible times come or evil empires rise, beastly things occur, well, in the end, God will triumph. And so there is hope. We have a hope. Our hope is so much different than the hope of the world, where people their only hope is they sit before a blue screen every night and stare away to try to forget their pain. Well, they grab onto some sort of substance abuse that enslaves them in the end. Or perhaps they chase other things. They chase relationships, careers, whatever it is, that they think is going to solve and heal that hurt, but it's not going to heal that hurt. But you as a Christian, you're blessed. Because you know that the pain we bear and the flesh we fight and the abuse we take, it's only temporary. Life is a vapor. But eternity is coming. And it lasts forever, where you are in the presence of the Lord, comforted. No more pain, no more sorrow. That's what John is trying to communicate here. And so these studies on Revelation, the reason I like them so much isn't because I want to talk about the nuances of eschatology and that we got to figure out about the EU and Antichrist and all that stuff. It's not for that reason necessarily, but it's that you and I would have an understanding that as we look at our world and how messed up it is, that we don't have to fear, bioterrorism or economic breakdowns or war or whatever we face. We don't have to be afraid of those things because Jesus is returning and he's coming soon and his reward is with him. And so those who get the message of Revelation, when we go through this stuff, we go through this life, it's not an idea of tribulation that we face. It's more of an idea of celebration because we know this is only temporary and there is hope on the horizon. This is the patience and the faith of the saints. And so he who has an ear, let him hear. And let's pray.